August 23rd, 2008, Blount County, Tennessee. After leaving his condo, 51-year-old Mike Hearon drives to his rural farm with plans to mow the lawn, and some neighbors see him driving away from his residence on his ATV. Mike vanishes without a trace, and his abandoned ATV is eventually found on a steep hill located a mile from his property. Mike's family suspects he may have stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see and became the victim of foul play, but there is no evidence to work with, and Mike is never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we're going to be exploring two very bizarre missing persons cases, the 2008 disappearance of Mike Hearon and the 2007 disappearance of Barbara Bolick. I first became familiar with both these cases over a decade ago when I was writing for listverse.com, and I featured them in an article I published there titled 10 People Who Vanished into Thin Air. And since I've received numerous requests to cover these disappearances over the years, and they each contain a limited amount of information, I thought it would be a good idea to cover them both on the same episode. Not to sound hyperbolic, but they really do seem like missing persons cases in which the victim literally vanished into thin air, as Mike Hearon and Barbara Bolick both disappeared in remote wilderness areas without leaving any evidence behind. Mike Hearon traveled to his farm in rural Tennessee with plans of mowing the lawn on a nearby property, but shortly after he arrived, he was seen driving away on his ATV, and this was the last time he was confirmed to be alive. When a search effort was launched for Mike, his abandoned ATV was eventually discovered on a hill located about a mile from his property. According to Mike's family, he had no reason to travel to this particular location, and they suspected that someone else planted the ATV there. They've always believed that Mike may have stumbled upon something illegal and got murdered for it, but there is no evidence to support this theory or any other theory for that matter. The disappearance of Barbara Bolick took place in rural Montana just 1 year before Mike went missing, as she went on a hike in the Bitterroot Mountains alongside a friend named Jim Ramaker. According to Jim, they were heading back down the mountain, and Barbara was walking several feet ahead of him when he briefly stopped at a scenic overlook. But by the time Jim started walking again, Barbara had completely vanished and he was unable to find her. On the surface, I'm sure Jim's story sounds awfully suspicious, but law enforcement does not consider him to be a suspect. Jim had no apparent motive to harm Barbara, and no evidence has been found to discredit his story or shed any light on what happened to her. So in this episode, I'll start off by discussing Mike's disappearance before sharing my theories and analysis, and then I'll do the same with Barbara's story. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on our regular feed. I also wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, July the 5th, we'll be holding one of our annual Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathons in which I screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. It's taking place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and if you would like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes, as well as pinned to the top of our Facebook page. Hope to see you there. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the disappearance of Mike Hearon. Our story begins in Blount County, Tennessee in 2008, and our central figure is 51-year-old Michael Edwin Hearon, who goes by the name Mike. After graduating from high school, Mike spent some time working for the National Park Service, trimming trails at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and he even participated in some rescue efforts for them. He then went on to start a successful home construction business called Michael Hearon Builders. Even though Mike has been divorced from his ex-wife for over 6 years, he maintains a close relationship with his two sons, Andy and Matt, who both work for his business as licensed contractors. Over the past year, Andy and Matt have each gotten married to their respective spouses, and Mike is looking forward to the possibility of them having children so he can become a grandfather. At this particular point, Mike spends about 3 or 4 nights per week staying at a condo in the town of Maryville in order to be near his business. But since he loves the outdoors, Mike usually spends weekends at a 100-acre farm he owns in the unincorporated community of Happy Valley. The farm is located at the end of Bell Branch Road, about 14 miles outside Maryville, and it borders the Abrams Creek Campground in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. At around 9:30 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, August the 23rd, Mike phoned both of his sons from his condo to let him know that he was heading to his farm and would be spending the day mowing the lawn on a neighboring property that belonged to some missionaries who had been out of town for a while. Since Matt did not answer, Mike left a voicemail for him, but he was able to speak with Andy on his cell phone and told him that he was going by his residence to pick up a lawnmower and trailer they both shared. Since Andy was on his way home, he told his father that he would help him load the mower onto the back of the trailer, but Mike went ahead and did it on his own. Shortly before he arrived, Andy passed by Mike's pickup truck and noticed that his trailer was hitched to the back and the mower was on top of it. A short time later, one of Mike's neighbors in Happy Valley saw him pulling his truck and trailer into his farm's driveway. At around 11:30 a.m., 2 of Mike's other neighbors would see him driving away from his property on his 4-wheel drive Yamaha Wolverine ATV. Mike waved to his neighbors as he headed down Bell Branch Road, but this would turn out to be the last time he was confirmed to be alive. Mike's parents, Burl and Alma Heron, lived close to his farm, but by the following day, they had not heard from Mike and were unable to reach him on the phone. They decided to walk to Mike's farm and noticed that his pickup truck was still parked in the driveway with the trailer attached and the lawnmower on top of it. When the Herons knocked on Mike's door, there was no answer, and they did not see any sign of him on the property. At around 2 p.m., Alma decided to contact Matt and Andy, who had both not heard from their fathers since the previous morning. But they were not overly concerned, as the farm was located in a remote area which did not have cell phone service. They also felt that Mike could have been working on the property a great distance from the residence and was unable to hear the house phone ringing or his parents knocking on the front door. Well, by the morning of Monday, August the 25th, Alma had still not heard from Mike, so she contacted her grandsons again. This prompted Matt to pay a visit to his father's condo in Maryville, and he noticed that Mike's car and motorcycle were still parked in the garage. Nothing seemed out of place inside the condo, as Mike's bed was made and the lights were off. Matt and Andy then traveled to the farm, where they saw that their father's truck was still parked in the driveway. They performed a search of the truck and discovered that Mike's driver's license, keys, cell phone, and credit cards were still inside, along with a gun he often carried. On Monday mornings, a school bus would park on Mike's property near the driveway for Mike to move his truck to a spot where it wouldn't be blocking the bus. He had not done so this time around. After Matt and Andy performed an extensive search of their father's property, as well as the adjacent campground and some nearby trails, they were unable to find Mike, and the only item which appeared to be missing was his Yamaha Wolverine ATV, which his neighbors had seen him riding on Saturday morning. Matt and Andy finally contacted the National Park Service to inform them about Mike's disappearance, and they were soon put in touch with the Blount County Sheriff's Office in order to file an official missing persons report. The following day, on August the 26th, a massive search effort was launched for Mike, which involved personnel from the Sheriff's Office, rangers from the National Park Service, the Blount County Rescue Squad, and the Blount County Fire Department. Even though one of the dogs from the Sheriff's Office Canine Unit tried to pick up Mike's scent from his truck, they were unable to track it anywhere. At around noon, one of Mike's friends came across his abandoned ATV, which was parked sideways on a steep hill off the road Happy Valley Loop. The hill was located next to an abandoned cabin, and was about a mile from Mike's property. Even though Mike had been planning to mow the lawn on another property on the day he went missing, it was still located about a mile and a half from the spot his ATV was found, and according to his family, Mike had no reason to frequent this particular area. The ATV was undamaged and still had gasoline in the tank, but it was parked in high gear with the keys in the ignition. The ignition switch was also still on, as the kill switch had been used to turn the ATV off. Mike's family said it would have been very uncharacteristic to use the kill switch and leave the ignition switch on, since that could have drained the battery. For this reason, they suspected that someone else besides Mike had abandoned the ATV on that hill. However, no footprints, blood, tissue, torn clothing, vehicle tracks, or any physical evidence could be found at the scene. But since rains had hit the area in the days following Mike's disappearance, and it was still raining on the morning of the search effort, potential evidence could have been washed away. The search effort for Mike continued, but even though it involved over 100 people and utilized cadaver dogs and helicopters, it failed to turn up any trace of him. According to Mike's loved ones, he'd been behaving normally prior to his disappearance and did not give off the impression of being depressed or suicidal or having any serious medical issues. Since he was very familiar with the area and had previously worked for the National Park Service, his family did not believe he would have gotten lost in the woods. Mike also did not have any known enemies, and there was no evidence to indicate he was involved in anything illegal, but his family suspected that he may have unwittingly stumbled across something illegal in the woods, which caused him to become the victim of foul play. Andy told the press, quote, "He would stand his ground. He was not a flight kind of guy. He was not afraid to say something if he encountered a wrong being perpetrated." End quote. They theorized that Mike may have been murdered at a different location than where his ATV was found before the responsible party disposed of his body and planted the ATV on the hill. The Blount County Sheriff's Office offered a $5,000 reward for information on Mike's whereabouts, and the amount was later increased to $15,000 after some anonymous donors contributed additional money. In spite of this, the reward failed to generate any substantial new leads, and while additional searches were performed of the area where Mike went missing, nothing could be found. Every year around the anniversary of Mike's disappearance, his family would attempt to raise awareness of his case by holding an annual Hike for Mike, a 2-mile trek, which began at the Happy Valley Community Club near Mike's farm. In the years after their father went missing, Matt and Andy would both have sons of their own, and they each gave their child the middle name Michael in tribute to their grandfather, whom these children have never got the opportunity to meet. Sadly, Mike Hearon passed away in August of 2020 at the age of 92 without receiving any answers about what happened to his son, though his obituary listed him as being preceded in death by Mike. Unfortunately, over the past 17 years, the investigation has failed to turn up any leads to shed light on what could have happened to Mike Hearon, so he continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, I first became familiar with Mike Hearon's disappearance when I included it in that article I published at listverse.com 12 years ago, and I was always left completely perplexed by it. And even though the case has continued to get a decent amount of exposure over the past decade, it's disappointing to learn that there seem to have been virtually no new leads or developments. Mike's 2 sons, Andy and Matt, frequently do interviews with the media in order to spread awareness of their father's case, and it seems like everyone who knew Mike described him as an all-around great guy who did not have any enemies with a motive to harm him. In case you're wondering, Mike's ex-wife was living in Maryville at the time he went missing, but she participated in the search effort for him, and I see nothing to indicate that she was ever considered to be a potential suspect. During online discussions about this case, I've seen people speculate that Mike may have secretly been involved in something illegal, such as drugs, which ultimately cost him his life, but the authorities have extensively investigated Mike's background and found no evidence to support this. I've seen a number of cases where someone went missing or died under suspicious circumstances in a rural area, and online sleuths have pushed forward the theory that the victim stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see, such as a drug deal, and wound up getting murdered for it. I've often felt that this theory is a heavily sensationalized one, as I'm not sure there are all that many documented real-life examples of someone being killed after stumbling across a drug deal in progress. However, I don't think this possibility is completely out of the question in Mike's case, and his family has always believed this is the most likely explanation for what happened to him. I certainly do not believe that Mike disappeared on his own, and there's no evidence to indicate that he may have been suicidal, particularly since his gun was found inside his truck. So the only other theory which makes sense is Mike getting injured or suffering some sort of medical issue in the woods before he succumbed to the elements, and all of the search efforts have wound up missing his remains. Since Mike lived on this property and was very familiar with the area and had previously worked for the National Park Service, his family does not believe he would have gotten lost, but if he suffered a stroke or something and became disoriented, it's possible he could have wandered away from his ATV. All we know for certain is that Mike's plan on the weekend he went missing was to travel to his farm and mow the lawn on a nearby property belonging to a group of missionaries who were out of town, but since the lawnmower was found on top of his trailer and the lawn was never cut, something obviously happened to Mike before he could get started. The last confirmed sighting of Mike was from a pair of neighbors who saw him on his ATV before he waved to them and then headed down Bell Branch Road away from his farm. It's worth noting that one of these neighbors was 80-year-old Grady Whitehead, who had spent 33 years working as a ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park and was an active participant in the search effort for Mike. Whitehead had a reputation as an expert tracker with extensive experience in search and rescue operations, and he even spent 90 days looking for Dennis Martin, a 7-year-old boy who went missing in the park in June of 1969 and was never found. There was a feeling that if anyone could find Mike, it would be Grady Whitehead, yet even he came up empty, which should give you an idea of how perplexing this case really is. Great Smoky Mountains National Park has seen its fair share of unsolved missing persons cases, including the 1976 disappearance of 16-year-old Trenny Gibson, who vanished during a school field trip to the park and was covered way back on episode number 100 of this podcast. Mike technically did not go missing inside the park, but rather on a property that bordered it, but what separates this case from the other Smoky Mountains disappearances is that even though the victim was never found, his ATV was. It was abandoned on a steep hill located about a mile away from Mike's property, and his family has always maintained that he was not familiar with this location and would not have had any logical reason to be there, which is why they believe that someone else planted the ATV at that spot. The biggest issue with figuring out what happened is that we really have no idea where Mike was going when he left his property on the ATV or what he was planning to do. It does not appear he was on his way to the neighboring property to mow the lawn, since he left his mower behind, so what was the purpose of this trip? Was he just planning a routine ride through the area before something went horribly wrong? Or did he make plans to meet with someone who did him harm? Since Mike left his gun behind in his truck, it seems apparent that even if he did have something planned, he did not believe his life might be at risk. Unfortunately, no physical evidence, such as footprints, tracks, or blood, was found in the area where the ATV was discovered, but the problem is that Mike had been missing for 3 days by that point, and rainfall had hit the area, so for all we know, any evidence that might have existed could have been washed away. And even if Mike was the victim of foul play, it's possible he was killed at an entirely different location before someone moved the ATV to that hill. The main reason Mike's family does not believe he parked it there was because the kill switch was used to stop the ATV and the ignition switch was left on, and this is not something Mike ordinarily would have done since it drained the battery. But of course, if Mike had become injured or disoriented or was experiencing a medical episode, you probably can't apply standard logic to his actions. If Mike did wander away from his ATV and succumb to the elements, the 3-day gap between his disappearance and the search effort could have given animals enough time to scatter his remains. Yes, the authorities went all out looking for Mike, but I've seen enough of these cases to know that even the best search efforts are capable of missing human remains. There are plenty of documented examples of a victim's bones being found in the same area where they disappeared years after the fact, even though the area had already been extensively searched. So for all we know, perhaps Mike's remains are still out there somewhere waiting to be discovered. All that being said, without any evidence pointing in any particular direction, I'm certainly not going to rule out the possibility of Mike being murdered, as the perpetrator would have had ample time to dispose of his body and cover their tracks. Since Mike's ATV was found near an abandoned cabin, I've seen speculation pushed forward online that the cabin could have been used as a makeshift lab to manufacture drugs such as methamphetamine, and when Mike stumbled upon it, he wound up being murdered. Well, if this is what happened, then these so-called drug manufacturers did a masterful job of covering their tracks, because the authorities have never mentioned finding any traces of drugs or any evidence whatsoever inside that cabin. And like I just mentioned, it's been theorized that Mike was killed at another location before his ATV was planted at that spot to divert attention away from the actual crime scene, so I don't think this cabin has any relevance to the case. But does this rule out the possibility of Mike stumbling across some illegal activity in another section of the woods? In spite of what TV shows like Breaking Bad might make you believe, I'm inclined to think that if an innocent person unwittingly came across an illegal drug deal or a drug operation taking place, most criminals would prefer not to commit murder to cover it up, since the penalty for that is much steeper than anything related to drugs. However, Mike's sons have stated that their father was the type of person who was not afraid to stand his ground and take action if he witnessed something illegal, which is why they find it believable that things could have escalated to the point where someone decided to kill him. While the ATV technically wasn't found on Mike's property, I guess it's possible that Mike could have discovered someone doing something illegal on his own property, which I'm sure he would have taken issue with. But if this is what happened, then the responsible party has essentially gotten away with the perfect crime, since no evidence has surfaced at all these past 17 years, and it seems like everyone involved has managed to keep their mouths shut the entire time. If Mike was the victim of foul play, that doesn't necessarily mean it was the result of him stumbling across something he wasn't supposed to see. It's been reported that Mike did not have any known enemies, but that doesn't preclude the possibility of him being murdered for personal reasons, but as of right now, there have never been any suspects or persons of interest. Without evidence pointing in any particular direction, I'm going to remain completely on the fence about this case, as I continue to go back and forth between Mike being murdered or him suffering some sort of injury or medical issue which caused him to succumb to the elements. If we can figure out the reason why Mike left his property on his ATV to begin with, it could shed some light on what might have happened to him. As it stands right now, this must be the absolute worst nightmare scenario for Mike's loved ones, because without any evidence, all they can do is speculate and let their imaginations run wild. But if you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Mike Hearon, please contact the Blount County Sheriff's Office at 865-273-5000. That's 865-273-5000. So now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in Montana in 2007, and our second victim is 55-year-old Barbara Bolick. Barbara lives with her 66-year-old husband, Carl Bolick, whom she has been married to for 14 years. Carl is a retired lieutenant colonel and Vietnam veteran from the United States Air Force, who originally met Barbara while he was stationed at a base in New Jersey. After working as the assistant director of security operations for J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, Carl retired in 2001, and he and Barbara decided to relocate to Montana and settle down near Corvallis, a small town located in Ravalli County. At this particular point, the Bolicks are being visited by Donna Biles, a cousin of Carl's who lives in California, as well as Donna's 58-year-old boyfriend, Jim Ramaker. Barbara is an avid hiker who loves to explore a lot of the local trails and has offered to take Donna and Jim on a hike in the Bitterroot Mountains, but since Carl suffered a heart attack years earlier, he is unable to accompany them. They were scheduled to leave between 8:30 and 9 a.m. on the morning of July the 18th, but since Donna had a bit too much to drink the previous evening and was feeling hungover, she decided to stay behind, so Barbara and Jim would embark on the hike by themselves. When they left, Barbara was carrying a black day pack containing a .357 Magnum pistol that Carl had bought for her for protection, though she did not bring her cell phone along with her. The plan was to use Jim's vehicle to drive 20 miles to the Bear Creek Overlook Trail, located just outside the town of Victor. Barbara had hiked this particular trail a dozen times before, and she was planning to take Jim on a 2.5-mile route up the Bitterroot Mountains to the Bear Creek Overlook, a triangular block of rock which has an elevation of around 7,000 feet. Barbara and Jim were scheduled to return home by the early afternoon, but when they failed to arrive, Donna started to become concerned. Finally, at around 2:30 p.m., Carl received a phone call from a United States Forest Service law enforcement officer who informed him that Barbara had been reported missing by Jim. Jim claimed that he and Barbara had hiked up the Bear Creek Overlook Trail as planned and arrived at the overlook, and after remaining there for about 30 to 40 minutes, they started heading back down the mountain. According to Jim, at around 11:35 a.m., Barbara was walking on the trail about 20 or 30 feet ahead of him when he stopped at a scenic overview in order to get a better look at the Bear Creek drainage. Even though Jim said that he only stopped for about 45 to 60 seconds, he said that when he turned his head back in Barbara's direction, she was gone. He continued back down the trail, but claimed that he could not find Barbara and never reported seeing or hearing anything unusual, even though the path had a lot of loose shale rock, meaning that Barbara likely would have made some noise if she stepped off the trail. When Jim reached the bottom of the mountain, a Forest Service work crew were in the midst of digging up and replacing a culvert, so he asked them if they had seen Barbara. When the crew said they hadn't, one of them accompanied Jim to his vehicle to confirm that Barbara wasn't there, and Jim said that he was going to head back up the trail to look for her. Jim claimed that he hiked up the mountain again to the overlook and spent about an hour and a half searching for Barbara. He even blew a whistle in hopes of drawing her attention, but he could not find her. He then hiked back down the trail and told the Forest Service crew he needed help, so he was put in touch with a Forest Service supervisor in order to report Barbara missing. A massive search effort was launched for Barbara, which involved Ravalli County Search and Rescue, Missoula County Search and Rescue, and Forest Service law enforcement. Homeland Security and the National Guard also provided some Black Hawk helicopters to assist with the search, who flew over the area with infrared night vision, but no trace of Barbara could be found. The only item that Barbara was believed to be carrying was the day pack containing her .357 Magnum pistol, and since her most important personal items, such as her identification, passport, and billfold, were left at home, no one believed that she would have disappeared voluntarily and abandoned her husband, her pet dog, and her pet cat. Carl described his wife as being a very healthy and athletic woman who was in good physical shape and had no noticeable medical issues or personal problems. During a statement to the press, Carl said, quote, "As best as anyone can tell, there is no indication of any animal, no bear or mountain lion, no sign of a struggle, no indication of foul play, no sign she became incapacitated off the side of the trail for a medical cause or abduction. It is just incredible. There seems to be no explanation at this point." End quote. Ravalli County Sheriff Chris Hoffman also confirmed that even though that particular trail was surrounded by rugged landscape, he believed it would not have been easy for an experienced hiker like Barbara to take a wrong turn, stating, quote, "It's a fairly confined area. The trail goes up to an overlook. It's an up and back deal. There's very little opportunity to get lost." End quote. Perry Johnson, the lead investigator for the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, also stated, quote, "This is a really tough one. It's outside my scope of experience. I haven't been able to find anyone else who's had a similar experience. We're talking about a minute, and then you look back and she's gone." End quote. Well, as unusual as Jim Ramaker's story may have sounded, there was some evidence to back it up. Jim claimed that when he and Barbara made it to the Bear Creek Overlook and sat down to have a snack, he noticed two clean-cut young men with a dog, and Barbara briefly spoke with them and asked how they were doing before they left. Around the same time, the Forest Service work crew arrived at the trailhead in order to begin their job replacing the culvert, and noticed that two vehicles were parked near a road closure sign they had set up: Jim's car and what appeared to be a light-colored, older model Chevrolet S10 Blazer, which had license plates from Missoula County. About 45 minutes to an hour after they started working, the crew said that two young men with a dog emerged from the trailhead. Both men were described as being in their early 20s and having athletic builds, and while one of them was dark-skinned and had black hair, the other had a medium complexion and reddish hair. The dog was described as being a black, mixed-breed canine with floppy ears and white markings. The crew claimed that the two men hung around for a few minutes and allowed their dog to play in a nearby creek before they presumably left the area in the Chevy Blazer. A composite sketch was created and circulated for the dark-haired man, and the authorities sent out a public plea for both men to come forward. They confirmed that neither man was considered to be a suspect in Barbara's disappearance, but they still wanted to question them. Other than Jim, there were no independent eyewitnesses who could actually place Barbara in the Bitterroot Mountains that day, so investigators wanted to see if these two men could corroborate Jim's story and confirm having seen Barbara at the Bear Creek Overlook. However, neither of these men could be tracked down or identified. Jim and Donna eventually returned to California, but investigators made it clear that they did not consider Jim to be a suspect, as Perry Johnson told the press, quote, "He's been cooperative and returned all of our calls. He's stayed in contact with us. Until something else happens, we find Barbara or find her body, I think he's just a witness. I want to be fair to Jim Ramaker. There's no evidence he did anything to Barbara." End quote. After the search efforts for Barbara were suspended, a private organization offered a $5,000 reward for information, though an additional $10,000 would later be added to the amount by Barbara's friends and family. Even though Barbara could not be found, the November 29, 2007 edition of the Ravalli Republic newspaper published a letter that Carl had written in which he expressed his thanks and appreciation for everyone who had participated in the search for his wife. Carl later revealed that the stress and anxiety surrounding Barbara's disappearance rendered him unable to sleep or eat, and he wound up losing 30 pounds over the summer. In spite of this, Carl eventually moved on with his life and became romantically involved with a woman from Idaho whom he met on a dating website, and she agreed to relocate to Montana and marry him in 2013. In January of 2014, a new article about Barbara's case was published in the Missoula Independent newspaper, and while Ravalli County Sheriff Hoffman confirmed that Jim was initially considered to be a person of interest, he now said that his department had, quote-unquote, for the most part ruled him out. When asked for his own thoughts about Jim, Carl said that he didn't want to speculate on his status as a person of interest, but he also revealed that Jim had initially offered to submit to a polygraph. Carl wished that the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office had taken Jim up on his offer before allowing him to return to California, stating, quote, "I think that they could have done more with him early on before he had the opportunity to get in touch with a lawyer." End quote. Carl also revealed that in the weeks after Barbara went missing, he learned that Donna had suggested to another family member that Barbara could have killed herself, which upset Carl so much that he decided to sever ties with Donna and Jim. For his part, Jim denied ever having harmed Barbara in any way, stating, quote, "I've had a cloud over my head since 2007, end quote. Sadly, in November of 2021, Carl passed away at the age of 80 without receiving any conclusive answers about what happened. It does not sound like there have been any major developments in the investigation in quite some time, so after 18 years, Barbara Bolick continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I can't think of too many other unsolved cold cases which have completely skirted the line between being a baffling mystery and having a pretty obvious solution. On one hand, Barbara Bolick went into the mountains alone with Jim Ramaker, and Jim was the only one who returned after sharing what, on the surface, appeared to be a completely unbelievable story about what happened to her. But on the other hand, there is no evidence to prove that Jim's story isn't true, and law enforcement has stated that they mostly ruled him out as a suspect. And you'd also think that if Jim was guilty of something, he would have been able to concoct a much better story. Several hours passed between when Barbara was last confirmed to be alive and Jim officially reported her missing, and while you should never underestimate the stupidity of people who do criminal acts, saying, "I turned my head for a minute and she vanished into thin air," is not the most convincing cover story when you're complicit in a murder. I can definitely understand why many people have their suspicions about Jim, but I also believe there are details which point away from him being responsible for Barbara's disappearance. Of course, much like Mike Hearon's case, I can't discount the possibility that this could have been a tragic accident where Barbara suffered some sort of medical issue which caused her to wander off the trail and succumb to the elements. And even though a massive search effort was performed which involved government helicopters using infrared heat sensors, this particular area is so rugged and vast that I could still see them missing Barbara's remains. Of course, this is a case where you can use the phrase, "the trail went cold," quite literally. The Bear Creek Overlook Trail was described as a very straightforward one, which involved nothing more than walking up and down a mountain, and since Barbara had already hiked it on multiple occasions, it doesn't seem likely that she would have gotten lost unless she became disoriented and wandered off the trail. Unlike Mike Hearon, Barbara had a companion who should have been able to assist her if she got injured or had a medical issue, but if Jim is telling the truth, what could have happened to Barbara in such a narrow window of time which caused her to vanish forever? A theory I have often seen pushed forward in this case is that Barbara could have been attacked by an animal, such as a mountain lion, perhaps after stepping off the trail to do something like, say, answer the call of nature. Yes, no evidence was found to support this scenario, and Jim never reported seeing or hearing anything, but Barbara was only 5 feet tall and weighed 115 pounds, so if she was attacked by a wild animal, they could have made quick work of her. But let's go back and start at the very beginning. I do want to establish that I do not believe Carl Bolick had any involvement in his wife's disappearance. As far as I can tell, law enforcement has never given off any indication that they suspected Carl, but I have seen online sleuths push forward the idea that Carl hired Jim to get rid of Barbara during their hike into the mountains, while he established an alibi for himself by remaining at home. This theory seems to be based on nothing more than the fact that Carl eventually got remarried, but I don't find it suspicious that the spouse of a missing woman would elect to get married to someone else 6 years after the fact. From what I can tell, there were no serious issues in the Bollock's marriage, and Carl had no apparent motive to harm Barbara, and it sounds like he was left genuinely devastated by her disappearance. Carl was in his 70s by the time he got remarried, and I can understand someone that age not wanting to hold off on the minuscule chance that his missing wife might return someday. I've also seen suspicion directed towards Carl's cousin, Donna Biles, who decided to stay home and not accompany Barbara and Jim on their hike because she was feeling hungover. I do find it odd that Donna later pushed forward the theory that Barbara's disappearance was a suicide, which pretty much severed her relationship with Carl, though given that Barbara was supposedly carrying a .357 Magnum pistol in her day pack at the time she went missing, I suppose you can't completely discount the possibility that she went into some remote area and shot herself, and her remains have never been found. But I just don't know what motive Donna would have had to harm Barbara, though I would be curious to know if she ever had any suspicions about Jim, and if their relationship continued after they returned to California. When Barbara and Jim did not return home as scheduled that afternoon, it was Donna who started getting panicky right away, while Carl kept a cool head and pushed forward the idea that they might have just experienced a flat tire or something. So it does make you wonder if Donna may have had her own secret concerns about Barbara and Jim being in the mountains alone together. If Jim did harm Barbara, then I doubt it was premeditated murder, as once Donna backed out of the hike, he may have attempted to take advantage of the situation by making advances on Barbara while they were alone, but when she rejected him, things escalated into violence. However, even though there is not all that much information out there about Jim's background, it hasn't been reported that he had any prior history of violence or criminal activity or inappropriate behavior towards women. And if Barbara was willing to go hiking alone with Jim, then he probably never raised any red flags with her. Now, I think one of the reasons that amateur sleuths have pushed forward the idea that this was an organized murder plot involving Jim, Donna, and Carl is that it has never been independently verified that Barbara was ever in the Bitterroot Mountains that day. Some people have speculated that she never made it there to begin with, and even if Jim was the sole perpetrator, he could have killed Barbara at another location, disposed of her body, and then traveled to Bear Creek Overlook Trail in order to fabricate a cover story about Barbara getting lost. And this would explain why a massive search effort failed to uncover her remains. The only other witnesses we have are the Forest Service work crew who showed up at the trailhead that morning in order to dig up and replace a culvert and confirm that Jim's vehicle was already parked there at the time they arrived. It was about an hour later when Jim emerged from the trail to inform them that he couldn't find Barbara, and then went back up the trail to search for her for another hour and a half before he returned again and officially reported her missing. So if Jim was responsible for Barbara's disappearance, it sounds like he was putting on quite an elaborate act for this work crew in order to come across as a concerned individual who was looking for his missing friend. But I personally have a number of issues with this theory. After an official investigation was launched, law enforcement repeatedly stated that they were looking for a pair of young men in their 20s who hiked to the Bear Creek Overlook Trail that day with their dog and then presumably left the area in a Chevrolet S10 Blazer, which was parked by the trailhead when the work crew arrived. Jim claimed that he and Barbara saw these two guys at the Overlook and briefly interacted with them, and while investigators did not consider the two men to be suspects, they still wanted to speak with them so they could provide independent corroboration that Barbara was in the mountains that day and back up Jim's story. If we only had Jim's word that these two men were there, that would be one thing, but the work crew confirmed that they saw these guys emerge from the trail with their dog sometime before Jim did. Since we know for certain that they existed, why would Jim tell the authorities that he and Barbara crossed paths with these men unless he was telling the truth? Even though law enforcement sent out a public plea for the two men to come forward, they were never tracked down or identified, but there's no way Jim could have predicted this. If these guys did come forward and contradicted Jim's story by telling the authorities that they never saw Barbara, then Jim would be caught in a major lie and automatically become the prime suspect. Feeding a false story like that to investigators would have been a major risk on Jim's part, which is why I'm inclined to believe that Barbara did make it to Bear Creek Overlook that day and these two men actually saw her. I also see no reason to believe that they were involved in Barbara's disappearance because when they emerged from the trail, the work crew said they were acting casual and nonchalant and allowing their dog to play in a creek before they drove off. If they had just killed Barbara, I think they would have been in a much better hurry to get out of there, and of course, there's no chance they would have been able to load Barbara's body into their SUV and take her out of the area without the work crew seeing anything. The SUV had license plates for Missoula County, which is about 60 miles away from the Bear Creek Overlook Trail, so it's my guess that these guys were not from the area, and the only reason they didn't come forward is because they simply never found out about Barbara's disappearance and had no idea that the authorities were even looking for them. One thing I've always found a bit odd is that a composite sketch was created and circulated for the dark-haired man, but not the red-headed man, though I wonder if this is because the witnesses just didn't get a clear enough look at the second man to provide much of a description. Whatever the case, if these guys are ever tracked down or questioned, they could potentially shed some light on what happened that day. All that being said, even if the two men corroborated Jim's story and confirmed that Barbara made it to the top of the mountain, that doesn't necessarily clear Jim, since he still could have harmed Barbara after the men left. By Jim's own admission, he became separated from Barbara when he stopped at a scenic overview while she was walking about 20 to 30 feet ahead of him, but even though he claimed that he only stopped for about 45 to 60 seconds, Barbara somehow vanished without a trace, and Jim did not see or hear anything unusual. We know that the work crew saw Jim emerge from the trail alone, and he then went back up the mountain to spend an hour and a half searching for Barbara, but for all we know, perhaps he was using this time to dispose of her body and cover his tracks. However, from what I can tell, the work crew never reported seeing anything unusual about Jim to suggest he had recently committed murder or covered up a crime, as they did not describe him as being dirty, sweaty, out of breath, or having any blood or scratches on him. You also have to remember that even though Barbara had hiked the Bear Creek Overlook Trail on numerous occasions, Jim hailed from California and had never been to the area before. Since he was unfamiliar with the terrain, would Jim have been able to dispose of Barbara so thoroughly that she has not been found in 2 decades, and could he have pulled this off without leaving any evidence behind? It's interesting to look at the wording that law enforcement used when describing Jim's status as a suspect. They said that Jim was always cooperative with the investigation, and by 2014, 7 years after Barbara's disappearance, Ravalli County Sheriff Chris Hoffman publicly stated that his department had, quote-unquote, for the most part, ruled him out. That's obviously not the same thing as completely ruled out, but it does not sound like investigators have found any serious red flags with Jim's story or his actions to make them believe that he harmed Barbara or that his account of what happened is untrue. While Carl Bullock never directly accused Jim of anything, he did imply that he felt Jim was not as investigated as thoroughly as he should have been, and law enforcement should have taken him up on his offer to take a polygraph. Of course, we all know that polygraphs are unreliable, but would Jim have volunteered to take one in the first place if he was guilty? If Jim is truly innocent, the only other potential theories are Barbara wandering off the trail and either dying of exposure or some sort of medical issue or being attacked by an animal. Or alternatively, perhaps she crossed paths with another individual who harmed her, though I think the odds of this happening in such a remote area are pretty minuscule, and other than the 2 men with the dog, no one else was seen on the Bear Creek Overlook Trail that day. I'm sure you're still going to ask what could have possibly happened to Barbara during that 45 to 60 second window when Jim took his eyes off her without him seeing or hearing anything. Well, the possible answer to this question might be that Jim did not harm Barbara, and his version of events is more or less the truth, but he embellished certain details. Perhaps when Jim stopped at the scenic overview, he remained there for much longer than 45 to 60 seconds, thereby allowing Barbara to get much farther ahead of him. By the time Jim started walking again, something had already happened to Barbara which caused her to disappear from the trail, but when he shared this story several hours later, Jim either misremembered how long he stopped, or he embellished that detail, possibly because he felt guilty over having lost track of Barbara and wanted to minimize his own culpability. Look, I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that Jim did not harm Barbara, as maybe the sheriff's office decision to, quote-unquote, for the most part rule him out, is based on a faulty investigation. But I cannot ignore the fact that there is no evidence to prove that Jim had any involvement in Barbara's disappearance. You can apply the same logic here that I applied to the disappearance of Mike Hearon. If someone did murder Barbara, they covered their tracks extremely well and essentially got away with the perfect crime. While there is no evidence pointing towards Jim, there is no evidence pointing towards any theory in particular, which is why this case is so frustrating. But we are talking about someone who went missing in the wilderness, where anything can go horribly wrong in a split second, and you can vanish without a trace so thoroughly that even the best search efforts will fail to find you. For all we know, Barbara's remains might still be in the Bitterroot Mountains somewhere, just waiting to be discovered, but it would be nice if we can get some answers someday. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Barbara Bolick, please contact the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office at 406-375-4005. That's 406-375-4005. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released another one of my cinema-themed episodes titled 10 Underrated Crime Films, in which I discuss some of my favorite crime movies which I considered to be overlooked. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the story of the Hatbox Baby, an abandoned infant who was supposedly found in the Arizona desert on Christmas Eve in 1931. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of those commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Rebecca W. and Amy L. Thank you all so much for your support. I also wanted to mention that in just 2 weeks from now, The Trail Went Cool will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts, at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore, from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get a 20% discount on them. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20 for 20% off. And one final reminder that this coming Saturday, July the 5th, we'll be holding one of our annual Unsolved Mysteries Live Watch Marathons, in which I screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. It's taking place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and if you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes, as well as pinned at the top of our Facebook page. Hope to see you there. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for our next brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.